The Cecil Hotel loomed over Los Angeles like a malevolent specter. Its once grand facade, now chipped and stained, seemed to wear a permanent grimace. As an investigative journalist, I'd chased countless stories, but the Cecil held a morbid allure that transcended mere crime. It wasn't just the notorious events that had transpired within its walls. The suicides, the violence, the disappearances. It was the whispers, the persistent sense of a darkness that clung to the place like a shroud. Some called it coincidence, a string of bad luck plaguing a once proud establishment. But others, myself included, felt a deeper unease. The Cecil, they murmured, had a way of attracting evil, a vortex that sucked in the desperate and the depraved. It was with this chilling notion in mind that I sat down with Eleanor Brooks, a woman with a quiet demeanor that belied a hidden strength. Years had etched lines on her face, but her eyes still held a spark of defiance. She was the unassuming switchboard operator who, in the heart of the Great Depression, had faced down darkness within the belly of the beast. This is her story. It was pure chance that led me to Eleanor's story, a footnote in a yellowed article about a botched kidnapping at the Cecil decades ago. The switchboard operator's name, mentioned briefly, snagged something in the back of my mind. More than just a name, it was a feeling. Instinct whispered that there was more to it, something left unsaid. The hunt for Eleanor Brooks took weeks, a trail of old addresses and half-forgotten acquaintances. I finally found her in a small coastal town, the kind of place people escape to. There was a tension about her as I approached, a practiced politeness masking deep-rooted wariness. She wanted to know my intentions, whether I was just another exploiter of tragedy, eager to dredge up the Cecil's darkness for a cheap headline. I saw the struggle in her eyes. There was the natural human desire to set the past to rest, to let sleeping dogs lie. But there was also a flicker of something else, a flicker of curiosity, perhaps even a need, buried all these years, for someone to finally acknowledge those long-ago hours when she stood alone against something terrible. And truth be told, there was a good bit of that curiosity gnawing at me as well. What was it like, I wondered, to be an ordinary woman caught up in events so far removed from the ordinary? How did someone find the courage to act when every rational thought screamed to stay hidden, stay safe? We started recording early on Sunday morning, and we finished in the evening. I could tell the story took a lot out of her. I was immediately thrown back in time during the Great Depression as she began to speak. As soon as I hit the button to record, Mrs. Brooks began the following tale.
My name is Eleanor Brooks, and I worked at the Cecil for many years. I recall how the nights at the hotel stretched out like a never-ending dirge. The lobby clock coughed out its hours, each tick scratching at my nerves. I'd sit behind the old switchboard, all those worn brass buttons and tangled wires, and watch the world of the hotel parade by. Mostly a sorry parade it was these days. Dust Bowl refugees with haunted eyes, down-and-out salesmen with their threadbare suits and even threadbarer smiles, and the ones who made the place their permanent home. Well, the less said about them, the better. It seemed to me all the sorrows of the Great Depression ended up finding their way to the Cecil. Wasn't always that way. When I first landed this job, fresh from Nebraska with my ma's hopeful voice still ringing in my ears, the place had a faded sort of glamour. Women in furs and men with polished shoes would waltz through those doors. Now, even the bellhop uniforms drooped a bit sadder from the boys' shoulders. Me, though, well, I faded right into the background. Small and quiet, that's how folks always saw Eleanor Brooks. Made it that much easier to disappear behind this switchboard. At first, the work was about as thrilling as watching paint dry. Room 302 wants an extra towel. Mr. Smith on line 1. Nothing to write home about, as they say. But then, as the Depression tightened its grip and the clientele at the Cecil changed, so did my job. Turns out, desperate people with secrets to hide make for far more interesting calls than towel requests. You get to know the rhythm of a place, working the night shift like I did. The quiet hours when most everyone's either asleep or out stirring up trouble. That's when all sorts of whispered conversations seep through the lines. Gambling debts, angry wives, lies so heavy you could practically feel them straining the wires. Wasn't my place to judge. Everyone's got their own private miseries, especially in times like these. Still, a quiet shiver would run down my spine sometimes, that feeling like you're not alone, even when your booth's as empty as an old beggar's pockets. Now and then, I'd swear I'd catch a flicker of movement in the lobby mirror, a shadow in the hallway's dim light. The Cecil, she was an old girl, full of creaks and groans that the rational part of me blamed on settling floors and leaky pipes. But there's a fine line between rational and plain foolish. Let's just say I never liked venturing too far from my little switchboard sanctuary. Then came the night that changed everything. It started off ordinary enough, rain drumming a beat on the window, an out-of-tune radio crackling in the lobby. I was patching through some long-distance call, trying to get a clear line past all the storm interference when it hit me, that prickle on the back of your neck that tells you something ain't right. At first I couldn't place it, just a low murmur, barely audible over the static. Sounded like it was coming from one of the upstairs rooms. Now, I wasn't one for eavesdropping. Ma raised me proper, always said minding your own business was the best way to stay out of trouble. But this had a different feel to it. A tightness in the air, like a rope pulled taut just before it snaps. Should have cut the connection, done the respectable thing. Curiosity got the better of me, though. That, and a strange sort of pull, like something was reaching out through the wires, tugging at me. Before I could talk myself down, I'd lingered on the line, my worn earpiece pressed tight against my skull. That's when I heard them. 2 men. Voices rough like sandpaper, the kind that belonged in back alleys, not fancy hotel rooms. And their words, Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, the things they were saying. A snatch, that's what it was all about, a kidnapping, clear as day. My hand froze on the switchboard, cold fear washing over me in a sickening wave. Kidnapping. That word hung heavy in the air, a noose tightening around my throat. There was no doubt now about the kind of men I was listening to, the kind no God-fearing girl should ever hear. My first thought was to disconnect, ring Mr. Johnson, the manager. Surely he'd put a stop to this. But what if they were watching? What if they knew I'd been listening? The voices in my ear grew more urgent. Talk of a child, a wealthy family staying on the 5th floor. A name floated up through the static. Parker, the Parker family. I knew the name, saw it on the register just the day before. And Millie. That had to be their little girl. Sweet thing, always stopping by to smile at me with her gap-toothed grin. The image of her flashed through my mind, her bright eyes, her hand clutching a worn rag doll. My heart felt like a bird trapped in a too small cage. The men shifted their plot, a telegram to lure the parents away from the room, a maid sent up with a complimentary treat. The child would be alone, vulnerable. Panic flared up in me, replacing the cold fear with a burning determination. I wasn't much, just a small-town girl working an unglamorous job. But I couldn't let this happen. Not to Millie, not to anyone. My mind raced through desperate possibilities. Should I go to the police? But what proof did I have? A phantom call overheard in the dead of night? They'd laugh me right out of the station. I was alone in this. Eleanor Brooks, the quiet switchboard girl, was all that stood between that child and the monsters, whispering over the wires. It was then, as I listened to them finalizing their foul plans, that I began to form a plan of my own. It was a thread-thin thing, held together by desperation and more than a little luck. But it was all I had. With trembling fingers, I traced the wires connected to the Parkers' room, line 512. I committed it to memory, a lifeline in the swirling chaos. The men's voices cut off as their call ended. The silence that followed roared in my ears, broken only by the relentless tick of the clock and the frantic thudding of my own heart. My shift was almost over, morning creeping in through the grimy window. Soon the hotel would stir to life, the day staff arriving to provide a veneer of normalcy over the Cecil's festering heart. I knew I couldn't wait. Whatever I was going to do, it had to be now, while the rest of the hotel still slumbered. When the new switchboard operator relieved me, I didn't head for my tiny room like usual. Instead, I slipped into the service elevator, its jerky movement sending shivers down my spine. Floor by floor, my stomach twisted tighter, like I was riding that elevator straight down into the depths of hell itself. Finally, my legs carrying me as if in a dream, I stood outside room 512. The door loomed in front of me, an insurmountable barrier. I hesitated, 1,000 fears screaming at me. What if I was wrong? What if I was too late? What if they caught me? Then Millie's bright eyes flashed in my mind, and a wave of stubborn determination washed over me. I wouldn't be a coward. Taking a steadying breath, I reached for the doorknob and with a desperate twist, pushed my way into the very heart of the storm. Room 512 was a testament to wealth I'd only ever peeked at from afar. Plush carpet swallowed the sound of my footsteps. Silk drapes hung thick on the windows, blocking out the morning light. The scent of expensive perfume hung in the heavy air. It was all wrong, a place of luxury twisted into something sinister. My eyes fell on Millie, curled up asleep in the massive four-poster bed, her rag doll clutched against her chest. I swallowed hard, every protective instinct in my body crying out in alarm. It took all my strength to tear my gaze away from the sleeping child and scan the room, my mind working frantically. What could I do? How could I possibly warn them? Doubt gnawed at me, a poisonous worm whispering into my ear. It was madness, what I was even considering. A simple girl like me meddling in things she didn't understand, things that could get her hurt. Or worse. The memory of those rough men's voices sent another chill down my spine. These weren't petty crooks. They had a chilling efficiency about them, the kind that made my skin crawl. If I went to the manager, alerted anyone in the hotel, word could reach the kidnappers. They could vanish, and Millie along with them, swallowed up by the sprawling city. Or perhaps they weren't working alone. Perhaps there were eyes watching from within the shadows of the Cecil itself, eyes that would mark me as a threat. The loss of my job would be the least of my worries then. Yet the image of Millie's smiling face refused to fade. It was more than just a job now. Ma had always told me that right and wrong weren't always about the grand decisions, the things you read about in newspapers. They lived in the small choices, the moments when you stood up for what you believed in, even if your voice trembled and your legs felt like jelly. A surge of anger fueled me, a small but defiant flame in the face of my fear. Millie Parker, whoever her family was, didn't deserve to be a pawn in the wicked games of desperate men. It was simple as that. My path, perilous as it was, suddenly felt as clear as the morning sunlight starting to peek through the curtains. I wouldn't go to the authorities. I'd warn the family myself. Decision made, I searched through the piles of expensive luggage for something to write a note on. My fingers located hotel stationery and a silver pen I knew better than to use myself. The words spilled out of me, shaky at first, then bolder as I found my rhythm. A brief warning, the danger, the plan to lure Millie out with a treat, the necessity to stay in their room. No signature, only the hurried plea to, please trust me. Hands trembling, I folded the note small, tucking it into the waistband of my uniform. My eyes darted to the telephone sitting on the bedside table. It was tempting, oh so tempting, to simply lift the receiver, ring the Parkers, and spill the whole ugly truth. But with that call, all control would be lost. No, this was the only way, a silent plea delivered to their very hands, trusting that Millie's parents had the sense to heed the warning. My task completed, a desperate urge to flee the room warred with the strange, heavy responsibility now weighing on my shoulders. I took one last look at the unsuspecting child still sleeping soundly in that opulent bed. As oblivious to the darkness as a lamb in a wolf's den, I silently promised myself that I wouldn't give up until I knew she was safe. With a final glance around the room, ensuring I hadn't disturbed anything, I turned and slipped out. The journey back to the lobby felt like the longest of my life. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of shadow, sent my heart leaping into my throat. Was I being watched? Was there already someone in my switchboard booth? Some grim-faced man who knew about my eavesdropping? The relief washing over me when I reached the deserted lobby was almost overwhelming. I collapsed onto my worn chair, breath stuttering out in ragged gasps. For a long moment, all I could do was stare blankly ahead, my mind running frantically through worst-case scenarios. Every rustle of newspaper, every muffled cough from one of the worn armchairs where down and outers sought shelter seemed like a threat. Time became elastic, stretching into an unbearable tautness. Was the warning enough? Would Millie's parents receive it in time? Would they believe a frantic, anonymous note tucked into their room? Had I doomed them all by interfering? The hands on the lobby clock crawled with agonizing slowness. My mind conjured up horrific images. Millie dragged screaming down a dimly lit hallway, her parents discovering my note too late, their faces etched with terror and guilt. I forced myself to sit up straighter, to breathe deep. Self-pity wouldn't save Millie, nor would it help me endure what might come next. I was Eleanor Brooks, small-town girl with more stubbornness than sense, and I like to think it was that stubbornness that got me through the rest of my shift. But when dawn spilled through the dusty windows, and I was finally free to stumble up to my tiny room, fear clung to me like a suffocating cloak. The battle had only just begun. The day following my desperate foray into room 512 was a blur of nervous energy and forced normalcy. Each time I patched a call through, every conversation I half-heartedly overheard, a fresh wave of panic would rise in my throat. Had the kidnappers discovered my interference? Were they watching me even now, planning their retribution? But Millie's face, shining bright and hopeful in my memory, forced me to act. I couldn't wait passively, hoping the danger would vanish. I had become part of this twisted plot. It was up to me to fight my way out, and more importantly, to keep that little girl safe. My first weapon, the switchboard itself, felt heavier in my hands. It was no longer a simple tool to facilitate the workings of the hotel, but a potential lifeline. I began listening more intently than ever before, straining my ears for any mention of the Parker family, conversations about children, anything out of the ordinary. Names slipped past in mumbled conversations. Johnson, the man I'd overheard, and someone called Slim, fragments that I clung to and filed away in my mind. With my limited access, the Parkers remained strangers to me. I had to rectify that. It was a delicate dance. Inquiries had to be subtle, masked as routine hotel procedure. A feigned misplacement of room keys meant a hastily scrawled note on their door asking them to stop by the switchboard. While Mr. Parker filled out a new key slip, I made a show of consulting the register, my eyes scanning the family's details. Facts emerged. Mr. Parker was a businessman, here from Chicago. Millie was their only child, 8 years old. They were leaving tomorrow. This last point made my stomach clench with dread. Time was running out. Next, I turned my focus to the hotel itself. The hotel, with its winding corridors and endless rooms, had always felt like a character in its own right. Now she was a battlefield I had to chart. Every spare moment I had between calls was filled with exploration. I ventured higher than I'd ever gone, pushing open heavy doors leading to staff areas, back stairwells, and dusty, forgotten floors. I memorized forgotten linen closets and supply rooms, creating a mental map of places rarely visited, places Millie could be hidden away from prying eyes. Finally, there were the hotel's inhabitants. Under normal circumstances, I paid them little mind, focusing only on my tasks at hand. But desperation breeds a strange sort of courage. I began to study faces, assessing the patrons as if they had the answers to a critical exam question. There was old Mrs. Thompson, a permanent resident who always left her door ajar, a collection of porcelain cats guarding her lonely domain. Could she be trusted with a whispered plea for help? Then there was Mr. Finch, an accountant who arrived like clockwork at the coffee shop each morning. His crisp suit and sharp eyes seemed to miss nothing. Perhaps he saw more than just numbers and invoices. Each potential ally brought its own set of risks. Would they believe me, a young girl with a story that bordered on the fantastical? Or worse, would they betray my trust, drawn by the promise of some reward from the kidnappers themselves? The Cecil had a way of blurring the lines between victim and perpetrator. I couldn't be sure where anyone's true loyalties lay. As evening approached, my nerves were wound tighter than the springs in an old armchair. The hotel bustled with its usual end-of-the-day activity, But beneath the surface, I sensed something different, a thrumming tension. Was it simply my own imagination, fueled by anxiety, or could others feel the shift in the air, a ripple caused by the dark plan taking shape within these walls? I knew I couldn't wait any longer. Direct action, however risky, was my only path now. As the hands of the lobby clock moved closer to the hour, I'd pieced together from the overheard conversation the time the fake complimentary treat was supposed to arrive at the Parkers' room. The outline of my plan, as shaky and insubstantial as it was, began to coalesce in my mind. It was a fool's gamble, a desperate play against men far more ruthless and experienced than I. But that stubborn spark ignited by Millie's innocent face refused to be extinguished. Failure and its consequences weren't an option. For her sake, and maybe for my own, a quiet switchboard operator was about to become someone else entirely. Night fell on the hotel like a suffocating blanket. The lobby lights were dialed lower, casting flickering shadows across the worn furnishings. It was in this dim cloak of artificial dusk that I felt most exposed, my senses straining to catch any trace of the brewing danger. The kidnappers' plan, as best as I could piece it together, hinged on two things: luring the Parkers out of their room and isolating Millie. I knew, with dreadful certainty, that today was the day. There was a buzz about the place, a charged atmosphere that set my teeth on edge. Each bellhop's hurried trip upstairs, every telegram delivered, seemed laden with hidden intent. My every interaction throbbed with tension, a constant game of cat and mouse played in whispered half-sentences and stolen glances. My first act of sabotage was swift and small. A telegram arrived addressed to Mr. Parker. One simple word: urgent. Business deals, delayed deliveries, 1,000 mundane reasons for such a message flitted through my mind. But I knew this was it, and the telegram met an unfortunate accident. Spilled coffee obscuring the address, rendering it undeliverable. My heart pounded in my chest as I disposed of the damp slip of paper, a single bead of sweat trickling down my spine. With the parents likely to stick close to their room, I had to focus on Millie. From my eavesdropping days, I remembered snatches of her routine: an afternoon trip to the park with her nanny, playtime in the threadbare hotel lounge. My window of opportunity was narrowing. Whatever the kidnappers were planning, it was meant to happen soon. Leaving my switchboard post was a calculated risk, but desperate times, as they say. An orchestrated power outage affecting a certain hallway, carefully timed with Millie's afternoon walk, plunged her route into temporary darkness. It lasted mere minutes at most, restored with a flurry of apologies from the harried manager. Yet it was enough. In the ensuing confusion, I managed to misplace the Parkers' room key at the front desk. A simple inconvenience that, with any luck, would buy me precious minutes. But the longer I pushed my luck, the more likely the invisible net around me would begin to tighten. There were moments: a lingering stare from the bellhop who'd been on duty the night of the fateful call, a low murmur from a group of men gathered in the bar. That sent my anxiety spiraling. I was playing a deadly game with predators, and my only weapon was my assumed insignificance. I donned the mask of a flustered, apologetic switchboard girl. Each stammered excuse, every wide-eyed plea of ignorance, became part of my armor. Yet beneath the practiced facade, I was a tightly coiled spring. I could see the change in their eyes. They weren't suspicious, not exactly, but observant. I was no longer a mere fixture of the hotel, overlooked and underestimated. I was a flicker on their radar, a potential nuisance. The day lurched towards twilight, each hour feeling heavier than the last. My acts of sabotage had been grains of sand thrown against an incoming tide. I could only hope they had bought enough time, upset the kidnappers' rhythm long enough to raise doubts in their perfectly orchestrated scheme. But what if they hadn't? The image of Millie snatched from her room while her unsuspecting parents stepped down the hall burned in my mind. As the hour of the complimentary treat approached, a new feeling crept over me, a kind of icy calm born from sheer exhaustion of fear. It was the calmness of a cornered animal. I couldn't run anymore. All that remained was to fight. My small corner of the hotel became my battleground. The brass buttons of the switchboard felt cool and slick under my palms. With trembling hands, I began tracing the lines that connected to various hotel rooms, to the front desk, to the manager's office. My plan now was a chaotic tangle in my own mind, a desperate symphony of distractions, misdirections, and stalled communications. If I could disrupt the flow of information, create just enough chaos, just perhaps I could delay them long enough for the Parkers to realize what was truly afoot. And then my tools would shift from wires and cunning to sheer panicked courage. If the kidnappers came for me, at least I'd know I did something. I wouldn't be a passive witness to an act of terrible cruelty. Millie Parker, whoever she was, wouldn't be some forgotten tragedy swallowed by the city. That stubborn spark in me, kindled by the sight of a sleeping child, refused to be extinguished so easily. Even if it was the last thing I did, I would make some noise. And perhaps, somewhere in the grimy heart of the hotel, amongst the lost and the desperate, that noise would somehow echo into something like hope. Darkness descended with an almost tangible weight. Each shadow seemed pregnant with menace, every creak a whispered threat. The quiet girl at the switchboard had retreated entirely, overtaken by a desperate, defiant woman with a plan so reckless it bordered on madness. Millie, blissfully unaware of the web of danger entangling her, had been returned to her room. I'd glimpsed her through a half-open door, the nanny departing with a cheerful wave. The sight of the rag doll clutched in her small hand made my determination spike with a force that overrode any remaining wisps of terror. She was no longer a name on a register, but a child, a symbol of something worth fighting for. My fingers, surprisingly steady, scribbled another short note. Direct this time, a desperate plea begging the Parkers to keep Millie close, to ignore any offers of treats. My hand trembled as I slipped it under their door, an unspoken prayer carried with it. I wouldn't know until it was too late if my warning had been heeded or dismissed as the ramblings of an overly anxious hotel employee. Time both crawled and bolted forward. My mind was a blur of half-formed contingencies and worst-case scenarios. I could feel the kidnappers' impatience, a shift in the currents of the hotel. One of them, the one they called Slim, paced in the back lobby, his eyes flicking toward the grand staircase at regular intervals. The complimentary treat, a poison confection meant to lure Millie out, was on its way, carried by some unwitting bellhop. I had to move. Distraction was my only remaining weapon. The switchboard was momentarily abandoned as I crept down a dim, dusty servant corridor. A box of matches, pilfered from the front desk, nestled in my clammy hand. My destination was an empty room, 2 floors above the Parkers. The strike of the match was deafening in the tense silence. I touched it to a frayed curtain, the flames catching with startling speed. It would be a small fire, easily contained, but that wasn't the point. The point was noise, alarm, chaos. As the muffled shouts echoed through the hallway, I made my way back to the switchboard, my heart a frantic drum in my chest. The next hour was a whirlwind of barely controlled pandemonium. I raised the alarm, my voice echoing shrilly through the old intercom system. Guests poked their heads out in startled confusion, roused from their torpor by the promise of unexpected excitement. I fumbled calls intentionally, misdirecting the fire crew sent by a frenzied Mr. Johnson. And all the while, I kept a close eye on the Parkers' floor. The moment I'd been dreading finally came. Slim emerged, his eyes narrowed, followed by Johnson and 2 other men I'd seen the kidnappers whispering with days before. There was no pretense now, no trace of the polished veneer some of them might have maintained. These were the predators laid bare, their fury barely contained. Without a word to me, they began a systematic search of the floor, kicking open unlocked doors, demanding room keys from bewildered guests. Each room cleared was an agonizing defeat. I held my breath, waiting for the shouts of rage when they discovered their quarry was missing. Their steps were getting closer. I knew they wouldn't hesitate to come for me. The quiet girl who had suddenly become so very inconvenient. There was nowhere left to run. I'd painted myself into a corner, a brush with destruction the only reward for my audacity. The confrontation, when it finally came, wasn't what I expected. No burly man barged into my little domain, demanding answers at gunpoint. Instead, it was Slim who slipped through the door, the barest hint of a sneer on his face.
Well, well,
He drawled, his voice deceptively smooth.
seems like the little mouse found her voice.
There was no time for denials, no room for excuses. I met his gaze head on, the last of my fear transmuting into cold defiance. They left, I said simply. The family with the little girl just packed up and walked out the front door. It was the smallest sliver of truth, twisted to buy what little time I could. Slim's composure cracked. He took a menacing step closer, the air around us growing thick with threat.
Don't play games with me, girl. You think you're clever? You've cost us time and money.
His words were cut short by a commotion in the hallway. It was Mr. Parker, his usually composed face etched with a mix of confusion and relief. He held Millie tightly by the hand, her rag doll dangling forgotten. Behind him, milling in the doorway, were bewildered guests and a disgruntled fire crew.
What in heaven's name?
Mr. Parker began, but I didn't wait for him to finish. I pointed towards a fleeing figure, Slim taking advantage of the distraction to make his escape. "There!" I cried, my voice hitching. "He went that way. The man who—" My words dissolved into a carefully staged, fainting spell, collapsing against the switchboard in a dead heap. The whirlwind moved on. There was shouting, a brief chase, the sounds of a scuffle. When I dared to sit up, it was to a very different scene. Mr. Parker hovered over me with concern, Millie's wide eyes mirroring his expression. The remains of the fire crew were departing, grumbling about false alarms. And in the distance, I could hear the fading wail of police sirens. There would be questions, I knew, awkward explanations that would paint me as an eccentric, perhaps unstable, young woman prone to hysterical outbursts and wild accusations. I might lose my job, might be asked to leave the Cecil under a cloud of suspicion, but it didn't matter. In the dimly lit hotel room, a small hand slipped into mine and a bright, grateful smile shone brighter than any of the tarnished fixtures of the grand lobby. The manager called me in. I told my story over and over, till the words felt worn and empty. They understood, or at least some of them did, but the hotel didn't want no big fuss, didn't want to scare off their guests. No big thank you, no job offer better than the switchboard. And yet, something had changed. The Cecil wasn't the same for me. I'd found, well, a strength inside myself I hadn't known was there. Each guest walking through that door carried a whole world of troubles I couldn't see, and I felt the weight of it different now. I knew the power of standing up, even if it was quiet-like, even if nobody but me heard the shouting. Time went on, weeks rolling into months. Did my job with a new kind of care and focus, listening harder to the voices that came through the switchboard, watching faces that passed me by. Knew that darkness lingered in those old walls, but I wasn't scared of it the same way. I'd faced it, done the right thing, even if my hands shook and my knees wobbled. The Cecil kept its secrets and I kept mine. To most folks, I was just that farm girl behind the switchboard, nothing special. But I walked those halls carrying the knowledge of one night when I'd made a difference, one night when I'd stopped something terrible. And though no songs would be sung about it, that feeling was like a medal pinned to my soul. The Cecil Hotel, it stood tall and tarnished in that big, mean city. But for me, it was something else too, a place I'd found my voice. Maybe nobody else would ever hear it clear, but it rung out true, strong as a fire bell, in the one moment that counted.
The last reel of the tape recorder clicked to a halt, and the silence of my small studio settled in like a heavy weight. Days had dissolved into nights as I listened to Eleanor Brooks's voice bring that long-ago night at the Cecil chillingly back to life. The knot of tension in my own chest refused to loosen. Her story wasn't one of dramatic heroics or thrilling escapes. It was a victory wrought in hushed back hallways, whispered warnings, and small acts of desperate defiance. The kind most people would overlook, dismiss as the actions of an overwrought girl caught up in something she barely understood. And maybe they'd be right. I glanced at the newspaper clipping that had begun my obsession with piecing together Eleanor Brooks's long-forgotten act. A brief obituary notice, a name and a few unremarkable life details. Died quietly at home. No mention of heroics, no acknowledgement of the lives she might have touched. A ripple swallowed back by the vast indifference of time. Perhaps Eleanor never did receive a proper thank you. Perhaps she returned to a life of quiet anonymity, her brush with danger a memory she kept hidden close, a bittersweet secret tucked away like the old room key from the hotel that I found among her belongings. Maybe there were whispers echoing through the hotel after that night, a bellhop let go for incompetence, a few patrons quietly asked to leave, seeds of doubt planted in the criminal networks that sought refuge in the hotel's shadows. Eleanor might never have known the true impact of her actions. But that wasn't the whole story, not really. As I looked out my window at the bustling cityscape, I pictured a different scene unfold. A businessman, a little wiser to the world's darkness, tucking his daughter a bit closer at night. A child, spared from a horrifying fate, growing up without the burden of a trauma that never came to pass. The impact of a single act of courage rippling out into lives Eleanor herself would never touch, a testament to the quiet strength of ordinary people. I sat down at my typewriter, the keys clacking out a rhythm born of newfound respect. It wouldn't be a front-page sensation or a gripping exposé. Instead, it would be a tribute to quiet heroism, an acknowledgement of the battles fought and won far from the spotlight. The story itself wouldn't change the world, but perhaps it could plant a seed in the heart of some reader, a reminder that the Eleanors of the world, unnoticed and underestimated, possess a strength that often shines brightest in the deep dark. As for the Cecil, that grim monument to the city's underbelly, it still stands, its secrets as tightly woven into its decaying facade as ever before. Yet for me, it now holds a different echo. It is not simply a place of despair and forgotten tragedies. It is where a switchboard operator named Eleanor Brooks found her voice, where she gambled everything on a desperate act of kindness, and in doing so, reminded us that the power to fight back, to make a difference, resides in the smallest, unlikeliest of places. We hope you have enjoyed this episode of Quantum Dispatches, and stay tuned next week for another thrilling adventure. Thank you for listening.